I think he's Ray Charles.
Would you want to go last?
Good afternoon. Today, we want to talk about one of the most important issues in international affairs, which has to do with the confrontations in Haiti. As everyone has read, Jovenel Moise, 53, was shot dead inside his home in the Perlin 5 neighborhood in the hills above Port-au-Prince on the 7th of July, 2021. The president was shot 12 times and had bullet wounds to his forehead and several to his torso. His left eye had been gouged out, and the bones in his arms and his ankle had been broken, according to one of the judges conducting the investigation. According to the BBC, a small army was involved. Haitian police say a group of mainly foreign mercenaries, 26 Colombians and 2 Haitian Americans, carried out the killing. Today, in light of these wrenching events, we want to talk about at least 3 important questions. Number one, to what extent is the violence, the recent violence, part of a legacy of colonialism? Second, to what extent has Haiti become a garrison state in which political and military elites vie with each other for power, recruiting local gangs as deadly agents to achieve their goals? And third, most important, the $64 question. Who killed Jovenel Moise? 28 people, automatic weapons, flights come from Colombia. This was no small operation. Who had the ability? Who had the interest? Pro bono. To talk about these critical questions, I want to introduce our guest of honor, which is Professor Irwin Stotzky. Professor Stotzky is one of UN's most distinguished professors, and I'm honored to work with him and call him friend. A graduate of the University of Chicago, author of several books, Send Them Back, Immigration Policy, Silencing the Guns in Haiti, The Promise of Deliberative Democracy. Author, scholar, professor at UM, and my friend. Irwin Stotzky, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience? Just take a couple minutes, tell them who you are.
In regard to my relationship to Haiti, I started working on Haitian immigration cases in the 70s, and still I am, by the way, and then started representing President Aristide in the early 90s. And after a coup overthrew him and he was returned to power, I led an investigation by international lawyers into the deaths of 5,000 people that occurred during his overthrow and until his return. I've also done a lot of human rights work all over the world, including in Argentina. After the military killed 30,000 of its own people, so I lived there for a few years and did that. I did some work in Rwanda and other places, and helped found an organization called the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti in the early 2000s, and we're still working on trying to help people in human rights cases in Haiti.
Well, I think that, as always, I think humility is a virtue in my book, and Irwin, in his expression of what he's done, has understated the importance. I think that he's done work which is of a historic dimension as a champion of human rights, and I'm honored to have you as my guest today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate
And
it.
so Professor Stotzky, Haiti, and I'm quoting from your book, Haiti is a product of a revolution against slavery and colonialism. It emerged as a nation in 1804 from the destruction of the French colony of Saint Dominique. By the late 18th century, approximately 1790, Saint Dominique was reputed to be one of the most profitable colonies in the Western world, profiting over human misery and death. But for me, it's most famous because it was the first place in the Western Hemisphere, at least, in which there was a successful slave revolt led by the great Toussaint Louverture.
And Jean-Jacques Dessalines.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Right.
sir. And so I think that because I think the legacy of slavery and the legacy of the slave revolt plays such the aftermath of colonialism plays such an important role. Perhaps you could tell us something about this,
Sure.
help to create a context for why this violence is taking
Well, to
place.
begin with, Saint Dominique was the richest colony in the Americas, mostly because it grew coffee and other products like that. And so the French brought more slaves to the New World than even the United States, and killed them at a faster rate due to disease and harsh treatment. And between 1791 and 1804, finally, the slaves revolted. And in an incredible war, they defeated Napoleon's army, the strongest army in the world, supposedly, and killed 50,000 of Napoleon's troops, and became the first Black independent nation, obviously, in this hemisphere, which, of course, frightened the United States, particularly the Southerners, because they thought if the United States recognized Haiti as an independent nation, there would be slave revolts in the South. So the U.S. never recognized Haiti as a nation until after the Civil War. Now, France wasn't too happy about losing the colony. So in 1825, they sent over 12 warships with 500 cannon to impress upon the Haitian people the need for reparations from their colonial empire. And it's a complicated process, but they required them to pay back 150 million gold francs, and made them take out a loan from the French banks at a huge usurious rate, so that the Haitian state at its beginning could never really form as a state, and they couldn't pay back the loan until the late 40s, early 50s. So at its inception, the Haitian state was attacked by world powers. Of course, the United States, Canada, and other nations went along with the French. And so what happened was, instead of the colonialists inducing slavery, the small elite class decided to recreate the plantation economy. Haitians wouldn't have it. So they settled on small plots of land. They either took away from the colonialists, or they were given by the state, and then produced all these crops. So what did the elite do? They came up with this brilliant but horrific plan. They kept the Haitians on their small plots and kept them out of politics. So what was created was two nations, the nation of Port-au-Prince and everything else, because most of Haiti was a rural countryside. And in fact, Haitians never really voted and didn't even know who the president was and through the 1950s when Duvalier was elected. That's one thing. The second thing they did was to steal their productive labor capacities. So the coffee and other crops that they grew were taxed incredibly heavily. And they had a tax collector called the Precepte, and a chef section, the chief of police in the rural countrysides, that kept these people at bay. And they taxed the crops at 90 to 95%. So the Haitians lived on hardly anything, and this small elite formed, which continues to this day. We call them the 100 families. They owned pretty much everything that should be state-owned, such as the electric facility, the cement plants, any kind of industry. And they tax people to death. So we have this group of people who formed allegiance with the military and effectively keep the rest of the Haitians at bay, killing them at any time they want to.
This dovetails with my second question, which has to do with something which one political science called the garrison state. But let me just say this. After slavery in the United States, blacks were re-enslaved through a system called the Black Codes.
Right.
And so if I see interesting parallels between the history of Haiti and the history of African Americans.
Absolutely.
We could also find parallels between the post-colonial regime that arose in slavery in Haiti, and those regimes which arise in Africa and other countries. Post-colonialism seems to be a disease which has a similar pattern, re-enslavement
by their very own people.
Yeah.
That's the scary part, you know.
Yeah.
So let me continue here. The United States invaded Haiti in 1914 and kept troops there until 1935. And what they did was to, quote, civilize the countryside by basically killing a lot of people. And the reason we entered was for commercial purposes. There's cheap labor there. We can use all of their farming crops and stuff and import them and grow crops in the United States, which costs more money, but impose embargoes on the crops from Haiti so that, for example, during the Clinton era, the rice production stopped, even though they had enough rice production, if you will, to feed their own people. So what happened then is they also created what is known as the Haitian Guard, the Haitian Army. And now, of course, the original Haitian Army actually fought the French. The Haitian Guard was created to keep the Haitian people at bay.
Yes. They're like the overseers.
Right. So essentially, when the U.S. cut a deal with the Duvaliers, and Papa Doc Duvalier was a clever politician, but he didn't do anything that had occurred previously in Haitian history. He slowly got rid of the military and created his own private power group called the Tontamacouts.
Yes, sir.
Who just killed people at will, stole their property, and kept them in line. And Duvalier and his gang used the state treasury as their own personal bank accounts. Between 51 and 86, when the Duvalier family ran Haiti, they killed approximately between 40 and 60,000 of their own people. And the U.S. gave them millions and billions of dollars in aid to keep the communists out of there. And when he passed away, Papa Doc, in 71, there was a vote which changed the Constitution to allow anybody over 18 to run for president. And then Baby Doc took over and allegedly got every single vote of the 2.5 million people who voted. So obviously, it wasn't a straight election. When he took over, he wasn't quite as efficient as his father. And by 1986, people were beginning to revolt. So the U.S. put him on a plane and sent him to France. At which point, a bunch of dictators took over.
Dictators.
Yeah, and then there was the international community created actually a fair election in 1990 in Duvalier, and that's when Aristide took power.
And you represented Aristide.
Yeah, much to the chagrin of the United States. I began representing him after he was elected and overthrown, when he came to Washington, and that's when I represented him, and he was finally returned because Clinton feared that more Haitians would be washing up on the shore, not because he did this out of the good altruism. And so I was on one of the planes that flew back to Haiti when Aristide was returned. There was really something. 20,000 U.S. troops ringed the airport, and thousands, if not millions, of Haitians were there cheering, and we returned to the palace. It was the first time a democratically elected president who had been overthrown was ever returned to power.
I noticed you said in your book that there were only 2 times when the Haitian people came together.
That was the second time. The
was,
first was the revolution. The second was that. And of course, the elite families weren't having anything to do with it. And so he only served till 1995. He came back and served 1 more year. Then Préval was elected. He was democratically elected, but he was so scared he really wasn't going to do anything.
There's class conflict in Haiti.
Oh, yeah.
Which is reflected in
absolutely
their disaffection.
And when you see, one of the problems is when you get aid to Haiti, there were more NGOs there than in any other country. The NGOs used the money to support their own groups. They never depended on the Haitian people from the ground up, so to speak. And there are a lot of really smart people in Haiti, whether they're farmers or otherwise, who know what Haiti needs. But instead, they bypass them, use the money themselves. None of it ever gets to the Haitian people. Nothing ever gets done. So there's, and of course, there are all these international disasters, earthquakes and hurricanes and floods where people die. They had no medical facilities. If you get sick in Haiti, if your natural immune system doesn't protect you, you can kiss your life goodbye, so to speak.
Well, let's move it on at this point, only because we have such, and I think what you've given us is a rich context to begin the discussion. One of the concepts that I think may help, and I want you to tell me whether it's helpful, is the concept of the garrison state. The garrison state is defined as a geographically discrete fortress urban areas marked by poverty, gang violence, political manipulation, and confrontational relationship with law enforcement institutions. Garrison communes are spatial expressions of both state power and community survival. And this was the idea of a political scientist named Carl Stone, who says that sometimes you have political elites which gain power by controlling gangs, who in turn do their bidding and then deliver elections to them.
Well, in Haiti, it's a little different. When they talk about gangs, they're talking about urban gangs, people from the ground up who realize they have no choice. It's like I lived in Chicago, so you know that there were all those street gangs, the Devil's Disciple and the Blackstone Rangers and stuff like that. And I happen to represent somebody from one of those gangs. Anyway, but to make the story a bit shorter, those are independent gangs. They really were not too happy with the elite and the military. The military go in constantly and kill all of them, or as much of them as they can. Then they gain some power themselves. So the elite doesn't really cut deals with these gangs generally. They cut deals with military people. And by the way, many of the elite families have their own military groups. They're called private security, but they actually are either police or army people. Now, Aristide abolished the army when he took power, which is the most incredible human rights act in the history of Haiti. But of course, they began to emerge again, and now they have some power. But the people who control the military are generally the elite families. So it's very complicated as to who is doing what to whom in Haiti. But you can rest assured that it's one of the elite families or several of them who are involved in any of these activities.
But in this context, in the context of the assassination of the prime minister, there's a particular gang member who comes to mind, and they call him Barbecue.
Yeah.
And so my hypothesis is that there's some connection between Barbecue and the political elite.
Well, there's another complication, which is the drug trade. I was also the head of an international drug group that examined the drug problem in Haiti. And we had the U.S. drug czar on it, Lee Brown, and the New York City police commissioner, Ray Kelly, who was in charge of the stop and frisk kind of stuff. So we examined it, and it turned out that the Colombians had cut deals with a lot of the Haitian military where they would land in Haiti in the middle of the countryside, and then they would take the drugs from there to the United States, mostly cocaine. So they decided they were going to infect Haiti with drugs, and they got a bunch of the kids involved in becoming addicts, which began to create crimes in Haiti, which had never occurred before. So a number of the gangs in the urban areas, but mostly the military and some of the elite families, are heavily involved in the drug trade. There was some sense that Martelli, who was the previous president, was also involved in it. I don't know if that's true or isn't true. So that was one of the links to saying, well, maybe he was involved in getting Jovenel Moise killed because Moise may have been involved in it too. I have no idea if any of that's true. On the other hand, I wouldn't doubt it. It's knowing what goes on. Hey, so it's complicated as to who's doing what to whom. So when they call it a garrison state, that's true. And who's cutting deals with whom is, it's like finding a needle in a haystack.
Well, let me ask this question. It's my understanding that Venezuela gave Haiti either oil or the proceeds of oil.
No, they gave them oil. And when they brought the oil over, and they gave them billions of dollars in it, somehow all the money disappeared because there's so much corruption in Haiti. So that's one of the three major issues. There's incredible violence. There's this historical class divide. And then there's the failure to follow the rule of law, not only in regard to violence, but in everyday economic activities. And there's a failure to follow law, period. So when they talk about the Haitian Supreme Court, it's pretty much a joke. And by the way, you said there was an investigation into his deaths. I know for a fact that 4 judges in those, it's a civil society in regard to the law. So
Yes.
prosecutors don't do the investigation, judges do.
Yes.
4 judges have so far refused to be involved in the investigation because they're all afraid they'll get killed. So there isn't any investigation going on at all. Maybe the FBI is involved to some extent, but I wouldn't know to what extent. The other part of it all is, they had UN troops there for many, many years,
Yeah.
and all they ever brought was sorrow. They brought the cholera epidemic that
Yeah.
killed 10,000 Haitians and infected over 1 million of them. They raped young girls.
Yeah.
They killed people. I mean, it's
And
so.
that shadow hangs over the possibility.
Yeah, I
of
think the only
intervention.
possibility for hope in Haiti is to rely on the Haitian people themselves. And so when the money comes in, there's supposedly, to protect them after the hurricane and the earthquake. Unless you allow the Haitian people to use the money, I wouldn't give it to the government. They're totally corrupt.
Right.
Then nothing's going to ever get done. The money will disappear again.
Well, let me ask this question: when Jovenel's wife survived,
Right.
and she said her husband was fighting an elite, and so although I don't accept the idea that he was a hero, I do suspect that there was that his death is tied to a conflict between rival factions within the Haitian elite.
I think that's right. One speculation by people, we have lawyers on the ground in Haiti. It's a group called the Bureau d'Avocat International. And the most famous Haitian human rights lawyer, Mario Joseph, is there.
Mhm.
And he brings cases, and he's always under threat of getting killed and stuff like that. So he thinks there's some kind of connection, but he doesn't know what it is, between political elites who may or may not be the rich elites,
Yeah.
and military people who, because what they did to his body shows that this was a feud. It wasn't just execute him, but
It wasn't just business. It was
Right.
personal.
So they thought it's possible that he was involved and was stealing money from people who thought they should get it, or taking power in ways they didn't like. So, for example, instead of stepping down after his term,
Parliament was dissolved.
he dissolved Parliament. He didn't step down, and then he declared basically a dictatorship by taking over all power. So
Mhm.
that got some of the people who probably put him in power
Mhm.
upset. So there's a possibility there. Again, I don't know what the answer is. Nobody
Well,
does.
I mean, did not Moise come to power with at least the acquiescence of the United States and the State
Oh,
Department?
sure. All these people always come to power with our acquiescence.
Okay.
We have had a direct role in Haiti. The CIA has been involved in all kinds of episodes there. But even if they've been involved there, the Haitian people think that everything that happens in Haiti is CIA directed, which is not true.
Mhm.
But a lot of it was in the past, and some incidents today are, but not everything. The Haitian elite, they're doing their own dirty work. In fact, many of them are paying millions of dollars to lobbyists in the United States,
Mhm. Mhm.
so they get senators and congressmen to go along with what they want.
Well, I mean, when I listen to the news and I try to, limit my intake as much as possible,
Yeah,
but
of course.
when I listen to the news, there's a Haitian doctor who has been identified as a person of interest. And my idea is this: there were at least 28 people who came from Colombia to the Dominican Republic and in Haiti. They had automatic weapons. They had to have an escape plan. Someone paid for the weapons. Someone paid for the tickets. Someone paid for them.
Right.
I don't think this was a Haitian doctor living in.
Oh no, he's a patsy. Someone sold him on the idea that he could be president of Haiti, and apparently he's a very religious guy, so he thought God had anointed him to this position, and they were just going to drop it in his lap. Remember that there were a couple of people here who supposedly supplied weapons. I don't know who they are, but when people go to investigate them, their businesses somehow disappeared and nobody knows where they are.
Right.
So whoever was involved in that, obviously they had connections in ways that we're unclear about.
And what deepens the mystery is that there were people on the scene who said that, well, yes,
I'm sorry.
yes, there were these 28 assassins from Haiti, but they arrived after the assassinations took place, and that there's a narrative that perhaps people who were in his own palace guard were the ones who committed directly, indirectly.
Yeah, anything's impossible. Obviously, they didn't do anything to stop it. So on one side or
None of
the
them
other,
were shot.
no, nothing. They didn't fire a shot either, as far as we know. So it was definitely
So it's thickened, and so I mean, one of the questions that I think has to hang heavy on our heads, given the history of colonialism, the history which we participated in, at least in the 1940s and 50s,
sure.
in our support of Papa Doc, is what is the responsibility of the United States? I think we've sent FBI. I think we've sent help with respect to the investigation. But what is the responsibility of the
Let's
United
give you an
States?
example. There's a notion called there's a statute called temporary protected status.
Yes.
When people from another nation, if being returned, could face natural disasters or
Yes.
military conflicts, etc., they're allowed to stay in the United States. Well,
Okay.
just yesterday, the head of HHS said that they're not going to extend temporary protected status for Haitians, even though the earthquake caused all kinds of problems, even though there's murders going on, even though there was an assassination, etc. So that's just one example of the way they treat Haitians, even though Joe Biden promised
That doesn't seem
the
quite
Haitians
right.
that he would do. No, it's definitely not right. That's number one. Number two, yeah, we have a direct relationship to a lot of things that have happened in Haiti. So we're directly involved. By the way, they're our neighbors, and there are huge numbers of Haitian Americans who live here. So obviously, we definitely have a direct interest in protecting
Do we have a
these people.
responsibility to send aid? This is not
Sure.
just a political crisis
Yeah,
and
no,
a
no.
murder.
That-
This is a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, of course. We are sending aid. The problem in Haiti is even if you sent all the aid they need, it's not clear you can get it to the people who need it because there's no institutional structures that exist. There's really no government that you would call a government to get any of these things
So
done.
it's not really, we don't have a democracy. There's no
Oh, no,
functioning
no.
government at all.
They're not a democracy. No, it's not. It's not real. But on the other hand, look at our country. We can't seem to even get people vaccinated. And we're a developed country and we're a rich country. So it's not such an easy thing. But honestly, the only way to help Haiti is to allow the people to help themselves by giving them aid and letting them figure out how to use it themselves. And there are a lot of good ideas. There are a lot of smart people there who can get things done. I can just give you an example. Every state has started a medical school and a law school that he's been running for now probably 20 years. And they're producing people who have skills and can do things to help their own people.
Well, I wish we had more time. I think that, as always, we have what we have to say is richer than the time we have to discuss it. We've been talking with Professor Irwin Stotzky, my colleague and friend, for the last few minutes. We're grateful for your wisdom, your insight, and for your activism over the years. Thank you, Professor Stotzky.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And so we'll continue this discussion. We'll continue the investigation, and we'll continue our prayers for the people of Haiti. My name is Donald Jones. I'm professor of law at the University of Miami, and we're happy to have this discussion and welcome Stotzky. And again, here's his book, Silencing the Guns in Haiti, and Send Them Back, Irwin P. Stotzky. We're going to sign out for Up Close, a social justice program. Stay tuned for our next episode in a couple weeks. God bless you all. Thank you.